So I'm going to talk about sustainable energy, and I'm going to offer a solution in which we don't actually have to eat people. So sustainable energy is really the main part, but not the only part, of the solution, I believe, to the climate change problem. And sustainable energy has two components. It has a clean component where we replace fossil fuels, that's coal, oil and gas, which produce our greenhouse problem. We replace them with renewable sources of energy. And I'm going to present some research to you that shows that, at least in the electricity sector, we could in fact move in Australia to 100% renewable electricity, and we could do it in a reliable way and an affordable way. The other component of sustainable energy is actually reducing the amount of unnecessary energy that we use. And we can do that by technology, through more efficient energy use, and we can do it by changing our behaviour through energy conservation. So they're the two components: reducing demand and replacing supply. Clean and lean together are the solution, I'm going to argue. So I think you all know why we need sustainable energy. Our climate is changing, and for those who've said, oh yes, well our climate in Australia has always changed, which is true, but what we're seeing now is a much greater frequency of heat waves and floods than we have ever seen before in recorded history. So we're actually seeing our climate changing as greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere increase. However, if there are any other doubters of climate science in the audience who couldn't quite bring themselves to put their hands up, there are a number of other good reasons for going to sustainable energy, in addition to combating human-induced climate change. So as Rod's already mentioned, we're more or less at the peak, or we may have passed the peak in global oil production. It's downhill all the way now, down that bell curve. And some people might be surprised to know that, in fact, within the next few decades, we will probably peak in the global production of coal, that is good quality coal that can be used for power stations and metallurgical processes and so on. So it may be a surprise. You won't be surprised to hear that electricity prices are increasing and gas prices are increasing, and they will continue to increase dramatically unless we move to renewable sources of energy in which we have, in most cases, no fuel price. Air pollution, respiratory diseases are also consequences of burning fossil fuels. Water pollution, and you can see a picture of land degradation. And also, despite all the rhetoric, there are actually very few jobs in fossil fuels. It's highly mechanised, and if you go on one of these guided tours through one of the power stations in the Latrobe Valley, you'll hardly see a person. There'll be giant machines digging the coal out, putting it on conveyor belts, trundling it into the power station, and when you go into the power station, you'll have a guide, and you might go past the control room where there's a few people, and that's it. In renewable energy, on the other hand, there are lots of jobs. So why do we need a transition? I think this cartoon says it all. There's lots of benefits to making this transition, and we should be pushing strongly for it. The jobs, well, you probably can't read that graph from the audience, but there are thousands and thousands of jobs in renewable energy, and in fact, the number of direct jobs that were counted in 2012 in Australia in renewable energy were 24,000. Now, although renewable energy is still only a small part of total energy generation, there were 24,000 jobs. There are only 5,000 direct jobs in the coal and electricity industry for using coal in Australia. Of course, there are some more jobs for export coal, and most of our coal is actually exported. So already we have a significant industry. So energy efficiency is one component of our sustainable energy system, and for people facing high electricity prices and gas prices, energy efficiency saves money and also protects the environment. So you've got energy efficient houses, solar efficient houses on the left. You've got a whole range of technologies now that are getting cheaper and cheaper all the time for saving energy. And it's all very exciting. I couldn't resist putting that heat pump in, heat pump hot water system on the top right hand side, because that system uses 1 kilowatt of electricity to produce 4.5 kilowatts of heat. Now, of course, it's not violating the conservation of energy, because the electricity is used to basically pump heat from, collecting it from the environment outside and pumping it into your building in winter, or into your hot water system to heat it. So that's a new system that hopefully, it's just been installed in my place, hopefully it will perform really well. Sustainable transport, there's an enormous amount we can do, starting with more walking, and I was really delighted to see that Shepparton has quite a large pedestrian area now. Electric bikes, electric cars, trains, trams, high-speed rail. How about a high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne, stopping at Shepparton? Wouldn't that be fantastic? Sustainable heating and cooling. I'm sure most of the audience here already knows the principles of solar efficient houses and so on, so I won't labour them now. And I am going to focus on renewable sources of electricity. And you've all heard our highly respected Prime Minister say the sun doesn't shine at night. Very profound philosophic conclusion. And the wind doesn't blow all the time. And both these statements are true, of course. But with a renewable system, electricity supply system, particularly on a large scale for the whole of eastern and southern Australia, you don't have one. You don't just have wind, you don't just have sun. You have a mixture of renewable energy sources with different properties, different statistical properties. So when the sun isn't shining, usually the wind is blowing. If the wind isn't blowing in Shepparton, it'll be blowing in South Gippsland, although some of the people there aren't very keen on wind turbines. So you have a mixture of technologies, concentrated solar thermal power with thermal storage in the top left. You all know solar PV, bioenergy that David's going to be talking about. That little picture in the bottom left shows a bioenergy power station in Queensland, burning mostly sugar cane residues and a bit of sawdust. Top right, of course, is a wind farm. Bottom right is what's called seawater pump storage. So they use cheap energy during off-peak periods to pump water from the ocean up to that reservoir, and then when they need peak energy, expensive energy during the peaks, they let the water fall down through pipes, turning turbines and generating electricity. And all those technologies, except for the wave power in the bottom, are commercially available now and could be scaled up very quickly. So you have a combination of technologies that together can form a system that's just as reliable of our polluting electricity supply system, which is mostly based on coal at present. So I'm arguing that renewable energy could replace fossil fuels, particularly for electricity generation. We also have to consider transport, which is more tricky, particularly for rural areas where the distances are rather great for electric vehicles, for batteries, and also for air travel, which is the other problematic area. So those areas are more difficult. We can use biofuels, so fuels produced from crop residues, to fuel vehicles on the ground and aircraft, but then there's a question of that Rod has raised about competition with food production and so on. So what is likely is, as we move to a renewable energy future, electricity will play a much greater role in transport and also in heat production. And so that's why I'm now going to focus a bit on electricity. and tell you some of the latest results of our research at the University of New South Wales and some of the other research from around the world on running whole countries on combinations of renewable energy. So, and these countries are taking it very seriously. They have targets. Denmark's target is 100% renewable electricity and heat by 2035. And there, as you know, if you've been to Denmark, it's a very flat country, so there's no hydroelectricity in Denmark itself. So they're mostly relying on wind, and wind is going to be providing about half their electricity. It's already about a third. It'll be half their electricity by 2020 already. Germany is going gangbusters for renewable energy. Scotland has a scheme to go to 100% renewable electricity. 2020 they claim, but I think that's a bit aspirational. China has the biggest generating capacity of wind power in the world. It is the biggest producer of solar photovoltaic modules, biggest manufacturer, and is starting to be a very large installer. It's the biggest manufacturer and user of solar hot water in the world. So when some of our politicians say, well, we're not going to do anything until China does something, well, actually, China puts us to shame. Sadly, they're doing everything. They're doing renewable energy, fossil fuels, and nuclear. But they have now announced that they're going to put a cap on their coal use, and they are putting a cap on their coal use in the future. So things are moving quickly. Okay, I won't go through all the details, except to say that some German states already have more than 100% renewable electricity. Now, how can this be? Well, they trade electricity by transmission line, so if they have excess excess wind power, they trade it with neighbouring states, they sell it, and so it goes. So to talk about 100% renewable electricity for Australia is not somehow really insane. These countries are already moving in that direction. And in fact, renewable energy has been incredibly successful. As has already been mentioned, the cost of solar PV, photovoltaic systems, has dropped dramatically in just a few years. In 8 years, the price of solar PV modules has dropped 80%. And it's still getting cheaper. Wind power is still getting cheaper. So we see a very successful industry, and this very success has excited a backlash from very powerful players. And these players are very influential with government, and the result is that the current federal government and most state governments are currently trying to stop the growth of renewable energy. It's quite open and blatant. So we see currently the review of the renewable energy target by a committee handpicked by the Prime Minister, which doesn't have a single member of the panel who knows anything about renewable energy. They're all fossil fuel and nuclear people, basically, chaired by climate science deniers. And of course, that has reported what the government wants, and we're waiting for the government's decision. The Australian Renewable Energy Agency will be closed if the government gets the numbers in the Senate. It funds research and development. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation has been funding demonstration plants around the country very successfully. It has been winning, levering private investment, so it's not all government investment, and it's been making a profit. It's actually getting its investment paid back. That'll be closed subject to a Senate vote. And it goes on. There's another inquiry into the sham wind turbine syndrome. It's a complete sham, not a shred of scientific evidence supporting health ill effects from wind farms. And it goes on. The election promise to subsidise 1 million solar roofs has been broken. State governments have cut feed-in tariffs, and now in 3 states, many electricity retailers are not paying anything for electricity fed back into the network from people who have solar power on their roofs. In fact, my household is an example of that. I pay nothing for solar, And for that reason, I am about to install batteries with the solar system and thumb my nose at them. And so it goes. And then finally, last but not least, there are all these myths about renewable energy that are being circulated by politicians, the Murdoch press, and even part of the Fairfax press, namely the Australian Financial Review. And these myths, you've all heard them before. Renewable energy can't provide baseload power. Baseload is like coal in Australia. And the assumption is that baseload power is necessary, but I will show in a moment that in fact it's totally unnecessary. Another variant of the myth is that baseload, that is coal-fired power stations, have to be run continuously to back up wind power and solar PV. Completely untrue. Renewable energy is too variable or intermittent to make a big contribution to industrial society. That's another myth. And so it goes. Renewable energy is too expensive, it's too diffuse, it's not ready, it's responsible for the big increases in electricity prices, and it goes on and on. All these claims are false, and the trouble is, some people actually believe them when they hear them from our politicians or read them in the newspapers. So why are we having these attacks? Because renewable energy has now been so successful, it is threatening the business models of the big electricity generators. It's threatening the coal industry. It's closing down coal-fired power stations in South Australia. It's very threatening. And there's two threats. There's one threat at a wholesale level, where wind farms with a very low operating cost are getting priority to operate in South Australia, where there's so much wind power. It's already a third of South Australia's annual electricity generation. So they're cutting out the coal stations. The coal stations aren't being used as backup, they're being shut down. South Australia has 2 coal-fired power stations. One of them is now shut down for the whole year, the other one is shut down for half the year, and the writing is on the wall for it. And then at the retail end, at our end of buying electricity, there's what's called the death spiral. And the death spiral is simply that the demand for electricity from the grid is declining. It has declined for the last 5 years, every year. It's declining because high electricity prices mean that people are using electricity more wisely, more efficiently, less wastefully. People are also installing solar photovoltaics and reducing their demand on the grid. And then also, of course, the continuing decline in the manufacturing industry in Australia, which governments of both major parties have been supporting, continues. So electricity demand is decreasing, and that means the utilities are raising electricity prices, and then more and more people use less electricity, and clearly it's a spiral to the death of the business model of electricity retailers and distributors. However, they have one thing still delaying that death, and that is your electricity bill has 2 components. One component, you pay an energy charge, which means the more electricity you use, the more you pay. But even if you use no electricity, if you're connected to the grid, you pay a fixed charge. It might be $1 a day or 80 cents a day. And what they're doing is lifting the fixed charge. And until batteries are cheap enough for us to disconnect entirely from the grid, we still are forced to pay that fixed charge. So they've delayed the death spiral a little bit. Okay, better hurry. Okay, so how do we bust these myths? Well, there's 2 ways. By practical experience from South Australia, from Denmark, which when I did that slide actually was 30% wind, but it's moving rapidly up towards 40%. And the other way is to build computer models of the whole electricity system, which a number of groups around the world, including ours at University of New South Wales, have been doing, and to simulate the operation of that system hour by hour through a year or more, with real data on electricity demand and real data on wind and sun across the system. So what we do each hour, we try to balance the actual demand with the actual wind and sun that is generating electricity, hypothetically, on the system. So we've looked at the yellow part of Australia, which is joined together by transmission lines. It's called grandiosely the national electricity market, but you can see it leaves out a small part of Australia. But anyway, Ben Elston, Ian McGill and I have been doing these computer simulations, and we were stimulated by a group called Beyond Zero Emissions that did a single simulation of 2 years and showed that with their particular choice of renewable energy technologies, they could reliably supply electricity demand over that 2-year period. So we decided we wanted to explore that in more detail. We have now done tens of thousands of simulations because our PhD student, Ben Elston, who's now a postdoctoral fellow, designed a brilliant computer program that actually simulated a whole year of data, hourly data, so we could run that in half a second or less. And so we could do thousands and thousands of simulations, find out what is the if we put costs on the technologies, we could work out what is the economic optimal mix of renewable energy technologies. We've been exploring different operational strategies for operating this whole system. And we've got some interesting results, and I'll just summarise them. So that's what a week's data looks like in summer. The peaks are the peaks in electricity demand in the middle of the afternoon that you get from the air conditioning. And the different colours are wind and solar PV and concentrated solar thermal power, and the pale blue is hydro, and so it goes. And there is absolutely, the base load is that part below the spikes, below the peaks. And you can see there's no problem supplying base load demand. It's a bit more challenging supplying peaks. So summer is a breeze because we've got a lot of solar energy in there, and plus wind. This is the most challenging week that we had in winter, and you can see wind is green, and on the left you can see there was a period when the wind was very low. Solar PV is the dark purple, and you could see there was a period there, and the yellow is concentrated solar thermal power, which was low in that period. So we had to fill in those gaps somehow, and that light brown is in fact gas turbines. Now you all know, you've all seen gas turbines, they're basically jet engines. And they don't have to run on natural gas, they can run on renewable gases and liquids. Biofuels, which Dave is going to talk about. And they're very cheap. Jet engines are cheap compared with coal-fired power stations or almost anything. They're not cheap if you're flying from Sydney to London, the fuel cost is enormous. But we've only got a few periods on winter evenings after overcast days when we need to run those gas turbines. And so the fuel cost is low as well. We treat them as reliability insurance with a low premium. So if we put dollar costs on the technologies, and we're using the government's own projections for 2030, which are very pessimistic for renewable energy, but we didn't want to be accused of being radical or something. We leave that to the government. And you can see that wind is 46% in the optimal mix, and solar PV, photovoltaics, is 20%. So 2/3 of the annual electricity generation is coming from intermittent or fluctuating sources, but those fluctuations are balanced by hydro, gas turbines and concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, which are less fluctuating. So we have a mixture of variable and flexible sources which produce a system that is just as reliable as the existing polluting system. Okay, finally, we looked at the economics of various alternatives. We compared on the left, we replaced our existing system with the most efficient fossil fuel power stations, and the bars show the greenhouse gas emissions. They're still enormous for efficient fossil fuels. The next one from the left is all gas, and you can see the emissions come down by about half, but they're still very high. And then we put in two hypotheticals coal and gas with what we call carbon capture and storage. These are unproven technologies, carbon capture and storage, but there's been a lot of claims that this would be the solution to the problem. So basically, this technology is supposed to capture the carbon dioxide that goes up the chimney of coal-fired power stations. And obviously, those technologies, if they became commercial, would have much lower emissions. But then we looked at the costs. And so for the efficient fossil system, we found that using the government's own cost figures, our 100% renewable energy system would compete with efficient fossil economically, provided we had a carbon price of at least $50 a tonne. Now, unfortunately, our previous carbon price, which was about $25 a tonne, has been shut down, terminated by the government. And we're not likely to have a carbon price in Australia for a while, until a certain amount of sense is seen. But even so, even without a carbon price, if we removed all the existing subsidies that go to the production and use of fossil fuels, our 100% renewable system would be competitive already. Fossil fuels are getting over $10 billion a year in subsidies, and that's not often admitted to by those who support them. The oil-gas scenario, a few years ago, gas would have romped home. It was so cheap. But gas prices in Eastern Australia are skyrocketing, and they're skyrocketing because the producers of gas make more money exporting the gas to Japan. So where we used to get gas for $3 a gigajoule, never mind what a gigajoule is, but for 3, in Japan you can sell it for $9 till $15 a gigajoule. And so why sell it to Australians at such low values? And so that's dragging up the gas prices. In Queensland, gas prices have already reached export parity. In New South Wales, they are heading there at a high rate. And our conclusion is that there is no way gas can compete with 100% renewables if it moves up to export prices in the rest of Eastern Australia. Carbon capture and storage on fossil fuels, these unproven technologies, we found that they could only compete under rather rare and peculiar conditions. So 100% renewables, if you want to cut emissions, that's the way to go. So we've busted a number of myths about renewable energy, and we don't need baseload power stations. We can run the system reliably on a mixture of variable and flexible renewable power stations. We don't have to run coal-fired power stations as backup for renewables. It's not too expensive, it's not too diffuse, and it's not immature, because in our simulations we're only using commercially available technologies. We just scale them up on a computer program. So finally, what can we do? And I'm suggesting, there really isn't time to go into it in detail, but I'm suggesting we need to act on 3 different levels: on our individual actions and household actions, at a community level, maybe Shepparton level, with community projects, with community action, and on a large-scale social and political area to try and influence the major political parties to actually become responsible and support this technology, which is clean, lean and safe and job creating. So if you want more information, I'm delighted to say that the Collins Bookshop is in that little annex off the foyer, and so don't leave without buying a copy of my book, Sustainable Energy Solutions for Climate Change. I will be signing it.
Okay, good.
So thanks ladies.